From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Tonight, it is my honor and privilege to announce that I will nominate Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court.
In a move to dramatically shift the Supreme Court to the right, President Trump's nominated federal Judge Brett Kavanaugh to fill Anthony Kennedy's seat on the High Court. Will President Trump succeed in his campaign promise to overturn Roe v. Wade?
Do you want the court, including the justices that you will name, to overturn Roe v. Wade, which includes, in fact, states a woman's right to abortion?
If we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices on, that's really what's going to be, that will happen. And that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am putting pro-life justices on the court.
We'll take an in-depth look at the Kavanaugh nomination with a roundtable of guests, including former Planned Parenthood President Cecile Richards.
I think there's enormous concern that this is a judicial nominee who was chosen not for his temperament, not for his experience, but because he was checked and approved by the Federalist Society, an organization that has supported the overturn of Roe versus Wade.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump has nominated federal Judge Brett Kavanaugh to replace retiring Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. If Kavanaugh is confirmed, it would create a block of 5 right-wing justices, making it the most conservative Supreme Court since the 1930s. Critics warn this could lead to major rollbacks of civil rights, environmental regulations, gun control measures, voting rights, and reproductive rights, including possibly overturning Roe v. Wade. This is Supreme Court nominee Judge Brett Kavanaugh speaking Monday night.
My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written. And a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent.
We'll host a roundtable discussion on Brett Kavanaugh after headlines. In immigration news, the Trump administration will not meet today's deadline to reunite all migrant children under the age of 5. Immigration officials took from their parents at the border, then sent to jails and detention centers across the country. The Justice Department says it will reunite only about half of the more than 100 migrant children under 5 today, after a federal judge in San Diego agreed to extend the deadline mandating the reunification of all of the youngest children. Today's secretive reunification operation will be overseen by the Department of Homeland Security and will involve transporting the children hundreds of miles across the country to undisclosed locations. In total, about 3,000 children are still separated from their parents. Meanwhile, federal Judge Dolly Gee in Los Angeles dealt a major blow to the Trump administration's efforts to indefinitely jail migrant families, including asylum seekers. She ruled the Trump administration cannot amend the 1997 Flores Agreement, which says children cannot be jailed for more than 20 days. All this comes as pro-immigration protests continue nationwide, including in Ohio, where 12 activists were arrested blockading an ICE office, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, in downtown Columbus. President Trump is flying to Brussels today for the NATO summit. Thousands rallied over the weekend in Brussels to oppose Trump's visit, many carrying banners reading pro-America, anti-Trump, and make peace great again. Today's opening of the NATO summit comes as British Prime Minister Theresa May's Conservative Party is in crisis after 2 top officials, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson and Brexit Secretary David Davis, resigned on Monday. In East Africa, the historic peace effort between Ethiopia and Eritrea continued Monday, with the leaders of the neighboring countries signing a joint declaration of peace and friendship and declaring an end to the nearly 2 decades-long state of war. From 1998 to 2000, Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a border war in which 70,000 people were killed. Since then, ongoing border disputes have kept the 2 countries in a state of conflict. This is UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres celebrating the news of the landmark peace declaration.
I believe that the recent evolution in relation to between Eritrea and Ethiopia is a very important signal of hope, not only for the two countries, not only for Africa, but for the whole world.
In Afghanistan, a suicide bomb attack in the eastern city of Jalalabad has killed at least 19 people, including 10 sikhs. At least 20 more people were wounded in the bombing, which came only hours after Afghan President Ashraf Ghani inaugurated a hospital in Jalalabad. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. In Burma, 2 Reuters journalists have been charged under Burma's colonial-era Official Secrets Act, which carries up to 14 years in prison. Wallon and Ja So-woo were arrested on December 12th as they investigated a Burmese military massacre of Rohingya Muslims committed in the village of Indin last September. This is Wallon speaking outside the court Monday.
We didn't commit any crime. What I'd like to say in relation to the court's decision today is that we will not give up. The court's decision is not a declaration that we are guilty. Even though we are charged, we are not guilty. We have an opportunity to defend ourselves. In the upcoming sessions, we'll testify to our innocence. We will not tremble before the charges laid on us.
In Haiti, workers launched a general strike Monday, shutting down the capital Port-au-Prince amidst ongoing anti-austerity protests nationwide. The protests began Friday when the government tried to dramatically raise fuel prices at the behest of the International Monetary Fund. This is Haitian protester François Anelson.
I think that President Jovenel Moïse should step down because of his incompetence, above all because he makes bad decisions. In this case, he should leave as soon as possible.
In Thailand, rescuers have evacuated all 12 boys from a youth soccer team and their coach from an underground cave. The group has been trapped since June 23rd. The dangerous rescue operation has captivated the world. In India, a widespread environmental movement in the capital, Delhi, has forced the government to abandon its plans to cut down 16,000 trees in a city that's already one of the most polluted on Earth. The month-long grassroots movement included thousands of people participating in vigils, sit-ins, tree defense patrols, and tree planting activities. Residents also filed lawsuits which forced a high court to halt all tree cutting in the city, ruling it could, quote, not allow Delhi to die at the cost of the redevelopment projects. Back in the United States, President Trump's longtime personal driver, Noel Clintron, has sued the Trump administration, sued the Trump organization, arguing he was not paid for more than 3,000 hours of overtime in recent years. The lawsuit argues, quote, in an utterly callous display of unwarranted privilege and entitlement, President Donald Trump has, through the defendant entities, exploited and denied significant wages to his own long-standing personal driver, unquote. Meanwhile, the Trump organization is seeking to hire 61 foreign guest workers through the H-2B visa program to cook and clean at Trump's private Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida. While Trump has sought to dramatically crack down on nearly every form of immigration into the United States during his time in office, he's expanded the H-2B visa program, which benefits companies seeking to hire foreign workers for seasonal, low-wage work. And in Virginia, a federal court has ruled a civil rights lawsuit against the neo-Nazis and white supremacists who planned last year's deadly rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, can move forward. The lawsuit filed by Charlottesville residents argues the organizers of the August 2017 Unite the Right rally violated the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act and the 1866 Civil Rights Act. The suit specifically names prominent white supremacists, including Jason Kessler, Richard Spencer, and James Fields, who killed the anti-racist protester Heather Heyer when he drove his car through a crowd of counter-protesters. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In a move to push the Supreme Court further to the right, President Trump has nominated federal judge Brett Kavanaugh to fill Anthony Kennedy's seat on the high court. If Kavanaugh is confirmed, it would create a block of 5 right-wing justices, likely making it the most conservative court since the 1930s. Critics warn this could lead to a major rollback of civil rights, environmental regulations, gun control measures, voting rights, and reproductive rights, including possibly overturning Roe v. Wade. While running for president, Trump openly vowed to only nominate justices who will overturn Roe v. Wade. Last year, Kavanaugh ruled against an undocumented teenager who sought to have an abortion while in federal detention. He said allowing the abortion would make the government, quote, complicit in something that is morally objectionable.
Brett Kavanaugh has also argued that sitting president should be shielded from criminal or civil investigations. In a 2009 article for the Minnesota Law Review, Kavanaugh wrote, "I believe the president should be excused from some of the burdens of ordinary citizenship while serving in office," unquote. He went on to write, "The indictment and trial of a sitting president, moreover, would cripple the federal government." On Monday night, President Trump urged the Senate to quickly approve Kavanaugh's nomination.
The rule of law is our nation's proud heritage. It is the cornerstone of our freedom. It is what guarantees equal justice. And the Senate now has the chance to protect this glorious heritage by sending Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court.
Brett Kavanaugh has deep ties to the Republican Party. Before becoming a federal judge, he served as a senior aide under President George W. Bush in the White House counsel's office. While at the White House, he met his wife, who was Bush's personal secretary. Kavanaugh also worked for Kenneth Starr, the independent counsel who investigated President Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Kavanaugh, like Justice Neil Gorsuch, clerked for Anthony Kennedy. And like Gorsuch before him, Kavanaugh is backed by the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, both of which drew up a list for Trump in 2016 of suitable right-wing judges to consider for the Supreme Court. On Monday night, Kavanaugh said he was honored to be considered for Kennedy's seat.
Tonight, it is my honor and privilege to announce that I will nominate Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court.
On Monday night, protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court soon after President Trump picked Brett Kavanaugh. Speakers included Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts.
He is hostile to health care for millions of Americans. He is opposed to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and corporate accountability. He is opposed to the rights of women, workers, and consumers. He is hostile to just about anyone who isn't wealthy and powerful. He thinks presidents like Trump should be above the law. And conservatives know he would overturn Roe versus Wade. I will be voting no.
Senator Elizabeth Warren speaking outside the Supreme Court Monday night, where about 1,000 people gathered. We'll spend the rest of today's show looking at the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. We'll begin in Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Ian Millhiser, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice. He's the author of the book Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. Ian Millhiser, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you give us a biography of President Trump's choice to replace Anthony Kennedy, Brett Kavanaugh?
Sure. I mean, this guy looks like he was grown in a vat by the Republican establishment. He literally went to the same elite prep school with Neil Gorsuch. I think they might have even been in the exact same class. He graduated from Yale twice, clerked for Justice Kennedy. He worked for Ken Starr, the Clinton inquisitor. He worked at an elite law firm, was a very senior aide to President Bush, and then for this last decade, he's been on the D.C. Circuit, the second most powerful court in the country, where he was a consistent antagonist of environmental regulations, where he said that he would have struck down — he didn't just say he would struck down net neutrality, he said that net neutrality violates the First Amendment, where he was a big proponent of gun rights and moved to strike down D.C. gun laws. So on issue after issue, abortion, birth control, he's got a really thick record, and he's very consistently voted with the right on issue after issue.
But if you can tell us the positions also that he has occupied over time, specifically working with President George W. Bush, involved in his actual election and the recount.
Right. I believe he may have even worked on the Bush v. Gore case. He went on to become what's called staff secretary in the White House, which is a very important job. The staff secretary handles every piece of paper that crosses the president's desk. And I think that's significant because the thing about Judge Kavanaugh isn't just that he's very right-wing and isn't just that he wants to dismantle much of the federal government. It's that he's extraordinarily smart, and through that experience handling literally every piece of paper that crossed President Bush's desk, he has a very sophisticated understanding of how the government works, where the leverage points are, where if he strikes down this regulation here, it leads to a lot of the EPA unraveling. And so he is going to be very, very effective in his mission of dismantling a great deal of the administrative state.
And Ian, you've written also about his role in what you call weaponizing the First Amendment. Some of the cases that he's decided really extending First Amendment rights to groups that normally we wouldn't consider the First Amendment applying to. Specifically, you talked about United States Telecom versus FCC, his impact on net neutrality, as well as other cases that seem to bend over backwards to give First Amendment rights to corporations.
Right. I mean, this is something we've seen. It's a major project of the Roberts Court. Just recently they nuked a lot of the funding that public sector unions are going to be able to receive. And they did that under the theory that when unions bargain, that is a First Amendment matter. And so therefore there can be strict restrictions on the union. The same or very similar logic is what Judge Kavanaugh used when he argued that net neutrality is unconstitutional. His claim was that if you regulate the Internet service provider's ability to not slow down certain content, then that is regulating their ability to determine which speech you get through their pipelines, and so that's a violation of the First Amendment. I suspect we're going to see this reasoning. I mean, again, this is a major project of the Roberts Court. It's to transform the First Amendment, which is supposed to be about free speech, into a vehicle for deregulating business. And what he has shown in that net neutrality case is he is eager to jump onto this project and probably has some new ideas for other places they can go.
Let's go to Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh speaking last night at the White House.
My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent. For the past 11 years, I've taught hundreds of students, primarily at Harvard Law School. I teach that the Constitution's separation of powers protects individual liberty.
Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh speaking last night after President Trump announced his nomination. Ian Millhiser, he was chosen by the Federalist Society. That's the list that President Trump was using to make his choice. Explain what the Federalist Society is.
Sure. So the Federalist Society is an organization of conservative lawyers. It's been around for a really long time. And what's interesting about the Federalist Society is it sort of benefits from this cycle where everyone knows if you want a judgeship from a Republican president or if you want a job in a Republican administration, the way to do that is you get a job or you get involved in the Federalist Society when you're a law student, you ingratiate yourself to them, and then they dole out favors. And so because everyone knows that they're the ones that can dole out those goodies, it's this self-perpetuating cycle where people get involved with the organization because they know it's the place to go, and that means that the best conservative lawyers are getting involved with it. The mechanism that this has provided is that the Federalist Society has moved very, very far to the right in recent years. They were one of the incubators for this idea that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. Recently, they've grown obsessed with dismantling federal agencies like the EPA or the Department of Labor. And those are all ideas that just weren't on the table 10 years ago. So what's happened is the Federalist Society has become the place where if you're ambitious and you want to get a good job in a Republican administration and you're a lawyer, you have to go through them. And they take more and more right-wing positions, which doesn't just mean that they're taking those positions. It means that every ambitious Republican lawyer in the country feels like they have to take these extreme positions or they're just not going to advance their career.
And I want to turn to Leonard Leo, the president of the Federalist Society, who was appearing on CBS This Morning last week. He was questioned by Norah O'Donnell.
But you have really been credited, along with the Federalist Society, of being involved in really the picks for the last three Supreme Court justices, Roberts, the Chief, Alito, and Gorsuch. Would you say that that's true?
Well, presidents always make these choices. Yes. But there's no question that there's been a longstanding movement in the United States to appoint judges to the court who are going to interpret the law as it's written, and I'm a part of that, certainly.
Three conservatives on the court. Let me read this. This has been said about you. Quote, "No one has been more dedicated to the enterprise of building a Supreme Court that will overturn Roe v. Wade than the Federalist Society's Leonard Leo." Do you believe with this pick, replacing Kennedy could finally be the nail in the coffin of abortion rights?
Roe v. Wade has been a scare tactic that's gone back 36 years, all the way back to Justice Sandra O'Connor's nomination to the court. And, nothing has happened to Roe in that period of time. And for me, it's not about Roe v. Wade. For constitutional conservatives, that's not what it's about. It's about interpreting the Constitution as it's written and basically interpreting the limits on government power, because that's really the way to preserve human dignity in our country.
So, Ian, can you talk about Leonard Leo and specifically his role? The reports that he's a member of the Knights of Malta, a secret right-wing organization within the Catholic Church, and his role specifically in the vetting of these nominees of the Republican presidents, and now especially President Trump, to the court?
Yeah, I mean, Leonard Leo's a very, very conservative guy who sits very close to the apex of this Federalist Society network that I was just describing. And he just knows who everyone is. I mean, that's his value to Republican presidents, is that when you become president, you have to fill literally thousands of jobs. And over the course of your presidency, potentially hundreds of judgeships. And most presidents just aren't going to know, like, who's the person who will make a good trial lawyer in Idaho, for example. Leonard Leo is the guy who knows all those people are. He spent his entire career, getting scotch with these people and having breakfast with these people and getting to know who the reliable, consistently very conservative judges or lawyers are that he can then advise presidents to put on the bench. And so that's why they use him. I also want to push back against a few things that he said. I mean, first of all, of course Kavanaugh is going to overrule Roe v. Wade. I mean, they've got 4 votes already who are willing to uphold a Texas law that was just a sham law intended to shut down abortion clinics. Kavanaugh is going to be the 5th. He's criticized Roe v. Wade. He said that it was a freewheeling decision. He wrote an opinion just last year that took a very aggressive posture, said that the Trump administration could literally imprison women to delay their ability to have an abortion. So this is not a guy who's going to stay his hand when it comes to Roe v. Wade. I think that Mr. Leo wants to muddy the waters a bit because there's 2 Republican senators, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who claim to be pro-choice, and at the very least they want to have deniability if they vote for Kavanaugh. But there's no deniability here. This guy is the fifth vote to overrule Roe v. Wade, period.
And we're going to talk more about that in our next segment. Ian Millhiser, we want to thank you for being with us, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice. We'll link to your piece, Who is Brett Kavanaugh? Trump's pick to replace Anthony Kennedy. This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.
It's raining men.
It's Raining Men by the Weather Girls here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
As we continue our discussion on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, we're joined by four guests. David Cole, he's the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. Cecile Richards is former president of Planned Parenthood. Rachel Tiven, CEO of Lambda Legal, the nation's oldest LGBTQ legal organization. And Fatima Gross-Graves, president of National Women's Law Center. Cecile Richards, I'd like to begin with you. Your reaction to the nomination of President Trump last night?
Well, I think this is a nomination that we've all been dreading. We know that Roe versus Wade hangs by one vote on the Supreme Court, and there are more than a dozen cases that are ready to come to the Supreme Court that would restrict reproductive rights. And it's interesting. I mean, not only, obviously, this is a nomination that was rubber stamped by the Federalist Society that's committed to overturning Roe. But I think the thing that's important to understand about Judge Kavanaugh is it is far beyond abortion rights. I mean, he has actually taken a position that bosses should be able to determine whether or not their employees get birth control based on their own personal points of view. He obviously disagreed with the finding the D.C. Circuit Court that the Affordable Care Act was could go forward. And I think the threats to women's health and women's rights are profound. Everything from not only abortion access, birth control access, but even the protection that we have now for folks with pre-existing conditions. So this is a very extreme appointment, and I think you're going to see folks coming out all across the country.
Let's go back to President Trump. That famous debate, October 2016, that was moderated by Chris Wallace.
Do you want the court, including the justices that you will name, to overturn Roe v. Wade, which includes, in fact, states a woman's right to abortion?
If we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices on, that's really what's going to be, that will happen. And that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am putting pro-life justices on the court. I will say this, it will go back to the states, and the states will then make a determination.
So President Trump has clearly said, when asked whether he wants to overturn Roe v. Wade, he's not going to ask these nominees, these candidates he has, about Roe v. Wade. But what exactly does it mean? I mean, he made this promise very clearly. We're going to overturn Roe v. Wade, and it'll go back to the states. What does this mean, Cecile Richards?
I mean, obviously what it means, or what it potentially means, is that then states across the country, it will depend on your state legislature, your governor, whether or not abortion is legal or not. And I think one of the things that's really important to remember, Amy, is that Roe versus Wade didn't create the idea of abortion. Abortion existed before it was legal. It was simply unsafe, and young, healthy women died routinely in emergency rooms across this country. I still meet doctors who can tell me they remember doing their residencies and their rotations, seeing women die. So the point is now, I think what the president is saying is we're going to actually now say that women may be safe in some states, but in a lot of states they won't be. My home state of Texas, where they actually have basically tried to outlaw abortion almost completely. We're going to go back to a day in which women had to go across the border or take things into their own hands. It's a very scary time for women.
And David Cole, from the perspective of the American Civil Liberties Union, what do you see in this nomination?
So the first thing I should say is that the ACLU, by policy, doesn't endorse or oppose nominees to the Supreme Court. We remain neutral. I think, to me, the biggest lesson here is elections matter. If Democrats had come out to vote for Hillary Clinton like they came out to vote for Barack Obama in the prior two elections, Hillary Clinton would have been appointing this nominee. She would have appointed Scalia's replacement. We would have an entirely different world. And that's the way politics works here. So I think the real response has to be politics.
But in terms of some of the decisions, that the record that we have right now of Kavanaugh, what do you see as some of the most troubling decisions he's made in the past from civil liberties perspective?
So I think, look, he's conservative. Anyone that President Trump would have named would be conservative. He's a very smart, very qualified conservative. That's what we were going to get, very likely. So, but I think, given what President Trump has said, that he wants to overturn Roe versus Wade, I think it's incumbent upon the Senate to really ask hard questions and demand answers to those questions. So, for example, do you believe in an evolving Constitution? Do you believe in a Constitution that made segregation unconstitutional because it wasn't unconstitutional when the 14th Amendment was adopted, that made sex discrimination a violation of the Equal Protection Clause because it wasn't a violation of the Equal Protection Clause if you read it as the founders interpreted it? Is he going to say, I'm an originalist, I don't believe that Brown versus Board was right, I don't believe women are protected by the Equal Protection Clause? Similarly, you could ask him, do you believe that the Constitution protects the freedom of individuals to make personal choices about their bodies and their families? That's the right recognized by the court for decades that guarantees every American the right to choose contraception, guarantees every woman the right to abortion, guarantees gay and lesbian couples the right to marry on equal terms as straight couples. Do you believe that? So I think we can ask those questions of him. His record is conservative, absolutely, but those seem to me to be the critical questions that you'd want to ask to see whether this is somebody who's going to really take us back to some kind of constitution that is unrecognizable, or whether he's not. And I don't think we know the answer to those questions, actually. I think he's been conservative, but he's been pragmatic. He has been criticized by the conservatives for not going hard right enough on the Affordable Care Act cases, on the Jane Doe case involving the young woman who was detained and denied an abortion. So I think it remains to be seen. But I think it's, we can't gamble on it. We need to have the senators ask very hard questions.
I want to actually ask you about immigration in a moment, even beyond Kavanaugh, ACLU involved in the latest issue to reunite children. Yeah. But I wanted to go back for a moment to Cecile Richards when you talk about the Jane Doe case. If you can talk about this young immigrant woman who is in immigration detention in Texas and what happened to her.
Yeah, well, this is, again, a case where, and obviously it was ACLU, thank goodness, was on the spot and defended her. But yes, he felt like it was not an undue burden to deny this young woman the ability to access a safe and legal abortion that she not only she had the resources for, she had the right to, she had gone through all the various stages that you have to go through in Texas, which is very hard, and the restrictions are so onerous. And he did not feel like it was an undue burden to delay this young woman's access to abortion. Fortunately, he was overruled. But that, to me, I mean, there's so many indications that, in fact, he is not sympathetic to abortion rights. He has praised, William Rehnquist in a very lengthy speech just recently, including Rehnquist's dissent in Roe versus Wade. And as we know, I mean, we just had this case, the Texas case that went up to the Supreme Court that declared the Texas laws unconstitutional. If there is one switch in the Supreme Court, those kinds of restrictions would now stand. I mean, this is a very, very serious decision, and I hope every single senator, including the two Republican women who have been very staunch supporters of abortion rights, actually ask specifically, what is his position on the right to abortion, which women have had for more than 40 years?
I want to turn to Fatima Goss-Graves, who is in Washington, D.C., president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center. Her recent op-ed for the New York Daily News headlined, "A Failed Litmus Test. Trump Taints His Supreme Court Pick with His Promise to Anti-Abortion Extremists." Share your reaction to President Trump's pick to the Supreme Court, and then also talk about the ACA, Obamacare, and what this choice means for health care in America.
Well, what we know here is that this isn't a typical time. You know, President Trump framed this process from the beginning as one in which he was guaranteeing, promising that his justice would overturn Roe versus Wade. And so we have to take him at his word. We know the steps he has taken to fulfill those sorts of political campaign promises. And so what that really means is that we can't have sort of a typical Senate process where, you know, the nominees ask questions and they say, yes, precedent is a thing. Yes, I respect precedent. We need a deeper investigation. We need far more here because the process has been tainted from the beginning. When you pair Trump's promises with the fact that he outsourced the creation of a list to choose from anti-abortion groups, it was a little bit baked from the beginning. It's not a typical time.
And what do you see as the potential for being able to block this nomination? Not only in terms of the two Republican women who might be expected to vote no, but also of the Democrats from red states, the Democrats senators from red states who may end up voting for him.
The good news is that Trump has made clear what is at stake by saying that his justice will overturn Roe. So we know what is at play. 70% of people do not want Roe versus Wade overturned. That is not the constitutional view that they are seeking. It's not the world that they want to live in. And so we have seen women rise in exciting and surprising ways time and again. They are the ones who have been making calls. They're the ones who are showing up at town halls, and they are the ones who will be showing up to fight this nomination.
What about the ACA, Fatima?
Well, that's another one of Trump's promises, that he would appoint justices who would basically dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And we know what is at stake, especially with regard to pre-existing conditions. You know, it wasn't that long ago when insurance companies used the idea of pre-existing conditions to be able to discriminate and charge people more or not allow them to have insurance at all. And women were treated as a pre-existing condition, and specific conditions that women have, whether it was having a pregnancy was considered a pre-existing condition, a C-section was considered a pre-existing condition. Even people who had experienced domestic violence or who had been raped and sought medical treatment, that was the sort of pre-existing condition that would allow insurance companies to discriminate. So we know what is at stake here, and the promises that have been laid out. That is the sort of thing that will have people out in giant numbers. We saw already the way people came out when the Republicans tried to eliminate the ACA. That was a political fight that was won already. The same issues are on the table here.
Last night, over 1,000 people rallied outside the Supreme Court to protest the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. This is Mara Kiesling, founder and executive director of the National Center for Transgender Equality.
People thought we couldn't save the ACA, and we saved it over and over and over again. Are we ready to save it again? This fight is not about R's and D's, senators. This fight is about the ACA. It's about Roe v. Wade. It is about protecting people's health and their lives. transgender people will not go back to being an uninsurable pre-existing condition.
That's Mara Kiesling. We're joined by Rachel Tiven, CEO of Lambda Legal, the nation's oldest LGBTQ legal organization. If you could elaborate on that and more, your concerns after President Trump made his nomination last night.
Absolutely. I think what's crucial here is we cannot afford 40 more years of Trump values on this court. And what we've learned from the Trump presidency is that you have to believe what people say. You have to watch what they do and take them at their word. And Brett Kavanaugh has been so aggressively hostile to abortion rights and so eager to establish a license to discriminate for people who don't feel comfortable following non-discrimination law. And that is why we are worried. Abortion rights are the foundation of individual liberty in the United States. And if abortion rights fall, and as my colleagues described, we are one vote away from possibly seeing Roe versus Wade, not just abortion, but birth control undermined. If that happens, then LGBTQ people are directly at risk. It is the foundation of individual liberty, and our rights to be free, not just marriage equality, but free in our own bedrooms, are really at risk.
Could you talk about the Family Research Council, which was very active when Kavanaugh was nominated to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals back in 2006, advocating for him, their impact as well?
They pushed for him very aggressively and cheered when after a lengthy process, he was eventually put on the court.
He had a lot of trouble in that confirmation hearing.
He had a lot of trouble in those confirmation hearings, and there were senators who felt that he was not truthful. So I think that it will take a very long time to look through this record. And I think that senators like Senator Durbin, who said at the time that they were not sure that he had been forthcoming, deserve a full accounting of his record and of all of the decisions that he has written and the dissents that he has written since then. That's going to take a long time. And the closer we get to the election, the more the McConnell standard should apply here. And we should let the American people decide if that's what Senator McConnell said was appropriate when Merrick Garland was nominated to the court, then surely that should be appropriate here.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guests are Rachel Tiven, head of Lambda Legal, Fatima Goss-Graves with the National Women's Law Center in Washington, David Cole, legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union, and Cecile Richards, former head of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Queen by Janelle Monáe featuring Erykah Badu. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we talk about President Trump's nomination for Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court to replace the retiring Anthony Kennedy. In fact, Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch were both clerks to Anthony Kennedy. Our guests are David Cole, who's legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union, which has become the rapid response organization in this country to all things Trump. Cecile Richards, former head of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. President Trump has promised to overturn Roe v. Wade. Rachel Tiven is head of Lambda Legal. And Fatima Goss-Graves is head of the National Women's Law Center in Washington, where she spoke. 1,000 people gathered last night after President Trump made his nomination. Cecile Richards.
Well, I think that one of the issues here that women have, of course, is equal representation on the courts, in Congress. And there is no way to avoid the fact that of the 113 Supreme Court justices in our lifetime, only 6 have not been white men. So yet again, we are now populating a court. And, of course, this president, I think more than 75% of his judicial nominees have been men. And as was discussed last night, when Roe versus Wade is at stake, it could be a court where that it is absolutely overturns the right to safe and legal abortion, and that is done by men. I think that the point that David made earlier is right. All of this is political. This is the most political nomination process I've ever seen. And women are enraged. I think we're seeing women, historic numbers of women running for office, women turning out to vote, women volunteering, women marching. This nomination is going to, I think, simply inflame women more, and it's going to have a huge impact in the November elections.
And David Cole, I wanted to ask you in terms of the legacy of Justice Kennedy and the vast difference between this nominee and what Kennedy represented. If you could talk about his role in terms of being not only conservative, but at the same time also seeing the Constitution, as you mentioned, as an evolving document.
Right. So Justice Kennedy was also a conservative, appointed by a Republican president, and voted often with the conservatives, particularly on business cases. But he had an open mind, and he believed in an evolving Constitution. And as a result, he was willing to listen and willing to depart from the sort of script and to side with the liberals in some cases, with the conservatives in others. And as a result, he kept the court within the mainstream of American society, notwithstanding that it's had a majority of conservative justices for the last 40 years. He wrote all of the court's gay rights decisions, a number of them 5-4, including the marriage equality. He was the 5th vote to preserve Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. He was the 5th vote to strike down the death penalty for juvenile. He was the 5th vote to hold that disparate impact is a violation of the Fair Housing Act, a critical interpretation of a civil rights statute. He was the 5th vote to save affirmative action. So, if it weren't for Justice Kennedy, we would be living in a very, very different constitutional world. And, the question will be, if Kavanaugh is confirmed and we have 5 more conservative justices on the court, will we be living in a very different world? And I think the answer, we don't know the answer, but I think we know this. The answer depends more on us than it does on Justice Kavanaugh. If we go to the polls at the midterms, if we go to the polls in 2020, if we turn this moment around into a galvanizing moment for those who believe in civil rights and civil liberties, and the politics of the country reflects that, and I think we can, the court has never, with one exception in our history, departed very substantially from where the mainstream of American public opinion is. And that one exception was in the progressive era and the early New Deal, where people and Congress and the president wanted worker protection laws, and the Supreme Court was striking them down left and right. What happened? The court became illegitimate, and it had to shift. So I think the answer has to be politics, and so politics includes fighting about this nomination, but I would say the real politics includes getting out there in the midterms, getting out there at 2020 and voting like your rights depend on it. And if that's the case, I think we will continue to have a court that is within the mainstream of American society, notwithstanding Justice Kavanaugh.
I wanted to go for a minute to what might have been one of the most compelling reasons for Trump to actually choose Brett Kavanaugh. And Judge Kavanaugh also arguing that sitting presidents should be shielded from criminal or civil investigations. In a 2009 article for the Minnesota Law Review, Kavanaugh wrote, "I believe the president should be excused from some of the burdens of ordinary citizenship while serving in office." He went on, "The indictment and trial of a sitting president, moreover, would cripple the federal government." So, David Cole, this is a man, Brett Kavanaugh, who actually worked with Ken Starr, who went after President Trump. Apparently, he changed his views, but at this point, he is the one on the record who says don't go after President Trump. And this could be very significant if the Mueller case goes to the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. But I think the thing about Kavanaugh on the president is twofold. One, yes, he's taken the position that there shouldn't be criminal trials and there shouldn't be civil trials. The Clinton administration took the position there shouldn't be civil trials, or at least they should be held off while the president is sitting. So it's not a radical position. But he also took a very bold view of what a president can be impeached for, including lying and obstructing justice. So, on the impeachment, he's the person who wrote the part of the Ken Starr report that justified the grounds for impeachment against President Clinton. And there was some thought that President Trump wouldn't appoint him because Kavanaugh's opinions on that question actually are against Trump's interests.
Explain that further.
Well, because what is the most likely impeachment charge against President Trump if there's the will to impeach him? It'll be obstruction of justice. And Kavanaugh's report sets out the legal theory by which that is an appropriate, right? You've got people like Alan Dershowitz saying the president cannot obstruct justice. Crazy position. But you've got Kavanaugh saying, no, the president can obstruct justice and can be impeached for obstructing justice.
Just to respectfully,
Cecile Richards.
Yes, I think. Look, here's what's important. We may not know exactly where Judge Kavanaugh stands, but I can tell you every single anti-choice organization in the country has been celebrating since last night. It's spread all over their web pages. They finally feel like they have got the fifth vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, and the fact is, 70% of people in this country believe that we should keep Roe versus Wade. It is overwhelmingly important to understand the vast majority of people in this country. And so while, we may not know exactly where he stands, I think I do have a pretty good idea, and it is going to be incumbent in this process to establish that he, in fact, recognizes and supports the right of women in this country to make their own decisions about their pregnancy. We cannot wait another 40 years for this court to change, because in the process, women are going to lose their rights, LGBTQ folks are going to lose their rights, women are going to lose their lives, and this is a really, really important nominating process.
And I want to emphasize how much people's lives are at stake in the short term. I mean, I share David's faith in the checks and balances of our system and the ultimate perfectibility, especially if everybody goes out to vote, if they are allowed to. But I think what's important to understand is if the Affordable Care Act is utterly gutted and overturned by this court, that has a drastic effect on the lives of LGBTQ people and particularly people living with HIV. At the time that the ACA was first passed, 17% of people living with HIV had access to private health insurance, and that left a huge gap in care. The ACA has been transformative for the lives of people living with HIV and AIDS. This is a death sentence if it is overturned by an activist court that doesn't really care whether people live or die.
So is your hope or expectation is that there will be a groundswell of popular
activity? We saw that the popular support for saving the Affordable Care Act was massive. Right. And so if everybody who called their senators about the ACA calls their senators about this nomination, it is absolutely possible to say that Brett Kavanaugh's views are not adequate to represent the American people.
Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins and South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham have both said they'll oppose any nominee who's openly hostile to Roe v. Wade. This is Senator Collins speaking on CNN.
I would not support a nominee who demonstrated hostility to Roe v. Wade, because that would mean to me that their judicial philosophy did not include a respect for established decisions, established law. And I believe that that is a very important fundamental tenet of our judicial system.
In fact, Senator Susan Collins, though she's voiced concerns, never opposed a Supreme Court nominee put forward by a Republican. Is that right, Fatima Goss-Graves? And what does it mean to say if they openly oppose a women's right to choose? It's sort of a way of telling Brett Kavanaugh, be very careful how you talk about your opposition.
This is why we need a higher standard. It is the truth that Susan Collins has never opposed a Supreme Court justice nominee from a Republican president. But we've also, are in not typical times where President Trump has promised that his nominee will overturn Roe versus Wade. So that is the question before her. And just having the nominee say, I respect precedent, is not going to be enough. You need this sort of deeper probing into whether or not they really believe that Roe v. Wade was correctly decided, which we already know that Judge Kavanaugh has criticized in the past. And we also need to know whether or not he believes in the personal liberty line of cases, because the same anti-abortion forces are also the ones that are anti-contraception, that are attacking the range of types of personal relationships that people have. And these are not hypothetical matters. We know that over 20 states are poised to ban abortion as soon as Roe is overturned. And having someone like Judge Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court will only incentivize the many states that have already been trying to restrict abortion access again and again, making it harder for people to access the care that they need.
David Cole, we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the current situation with the battle with the Trump administration on immigration and on the reuniting of those children separated from the parents that they were taken from.
Well, we are trying to hold the Trump administration's feet to the fire, and we're in court in San Diego where we got an injunction a couple weeks ago saying you got to reunite the families within 30 days, all the families, within 14 days, the children under 5. When we were back in court in the last couple days, they didn't even have a list of the children under 5, and they were, unclear whether they knew, which kids related to which parents. The judge, fortunately, is really, holding their feet to the fire, and we're basically in there talking with him and with the government on a daily basis about, are they doing enough? And the answer is no, they're not, but they're being pressured by a court to do that.
So the judge granted them an extension today for the under 5s. There's 2 weeks, and all 3,000 kids have to be reunited.
Right.
They have given the names of the 102 kids.
Yep.
They've reunited, under 50?
Yep.
Today, all at once, those 50 will be reunited, and then what happens to the other 50?
Well, I mean, I think realistically, they have to get them reunited as quickly as possible. They will not meet the deadline of today, but what you do is you continue to press. They screwed this up from the beginning, and they're not putting in sufficient resources to respond in a fast and efficient way. I mean, these are kids who are suffering, and parents who are suffering, separated from their families, and the government is coming in and saying we can't. At one point, the government said I have to dog sit for my dog back home, so I can't come in here on the weekend to have an emergency hearing. I mean, the Trump administration needs to take this more seriously. We're doing everything we can. I think the American people, by coming out and protesting and speaking out as forcefully as they have helped tremendously. And I hope we can get the kids and the families reunited.
Do you take this as a done deal? Brett Kavanaugh will be the next Supreme Court justice.
No.
Rachel Tiven.
No, not at all. Absolutely not. I think, first of all, look, this is a very, very closely divided Senate. Right, there are only a couple of votes need to shift for this nomination to be blocked, and when Senator McConnell has been so clear that when you're within, a year of an election, right? I mean, this is at what point will Democrats and surely some Republicans call out the hypocrisy here? I mean, I think that people are worried for the future of their country, and bipartisan people are worried for the future of their country.
Well, and I think, look, if the 5 million people who marched the day after the inauguration called their United States senators with concern, I think this process would be slowed down, and I think people would actually take a really hard look at this nominee. And I agree, this should be delayed until after the midterm elections. This is, the only way this nomination is going to get through is if they try to simply jam it through. And I think, again, Mitch McConnell, if it was good enough to delay under President Obama, it's good enough to delay under President Trump.
David, your wife serves on the same federal court as Judge Kavanaugh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any further comment?
No.
And finally, in the last 15 seconds, Fatima Gough-Graves, what are you going to be doing in these next months, the National Women's Law Center?
We're going all in. We believe that this is a fight that we can win. In the same way people counted out the ACA, we know that women will rise. They'll be making the calls. They'll be showing up at town halls, so people got to get ready.
We want to thank you all for being with us, and of course we'll continue to cover this process. David Cole, legal director of the ACLU, Cecile Richards, former head of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Rachel Tiven, head of Lambda Legal Defense, and Fatima Gough-Graves with the National Women's Law Center. That does it for our broadcast. A very happy birthday to Laura Gottesdiener. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for full-time news producer position in New York City. You can visit democracynow.org to learn more and apply today. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berger, Nate Feltz, Nina Nermeen Shea, Carla Wills, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Laura Gottesdiener, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud. I'm Amy Goodman. Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.